As I've gotten older, sleep stopped being something I could take for granted. Nights grew lighter, mornings heavier, and rest felt harder to reach. Long before I reached for melatonin, these quiet practices began restoring the deep, steady sleep my body truly needed. For much of my life, the day did not really end when the lights went out. My body lay in bed, but my mind stayed upright, alert and busy. I replayed conversations, reviewed decisions, and quietly planned the next morning before the present one had even closed. I thought this was normal, responsible even. Sleep, I believed, would simply arrive when it was ready, regardless of what I carried into it. As I've gotten older, I've learned how mistaken that belief was. Sleep does not arrive on command. It responds to invitation. And for years, I was inviting everything except rest into my evenings. The habit of carrying the day into the night develops slowly. It begins with small things, checking one last message, finishing one more task, thinking through tomorrow's obligations while brushing your teeth. None of it feels harmful. In fact, it feels productive. But the body does not understand productivity in the same way the mind does. When the mind stays active, the body stays alert. And an alert body does not rest easily. I noticed the shift gradually. Falling asleep took longer. Waking up became more frequent. Mornings felt heavier, as if sleep had skimmed the surface but never truly reached me. I blamed age at first. Then I blamed my schedule. It took time to see that the problem wasn't how much sleep I was getting, but how I was arriving at it. Evenings had become compressed versions of the day, still full, still urgent, just dimmer. The first change did not come from adding a new routine or enforcing strict rules. It came from recognizing that the body needs a sense of closure before it can let go. When the day ends abruptly, without transition, the nervous system doesn't register safety. It stays partially engaged, waiting for the next demand. I began experimenting with letting the day wind down instead of simply stopping it. This did not mean ignoring responsibilities or leaving life unfinished. It meant changing how I exited the day. Instead of moving directly from activity to bed, I allowed space in between, not long and not elaborate. Just enough to signal that nothing else was required of me for now. At first, this felt uncomfortable. Slowing down felt like falling behind. There was a subtle guilt attached to it, a sense that I should still be doing something useful. That guilt, I learned, was part of the problem. It kept my body tense even when nothing was happening. So I began to notice my transitions. I paid attention to how I moved from dinner to evening, from evening to night, from night to bed. I stopped rushing these moments. I allowed them to stretch slightly, the way dusk stretches before darkness. This simple act changed the tone of my evenings more than I expected. One of the most important shifts was learning to leave certain thoughts unfinished on purpose. I had spent years believing that clarity came from resolution, that if I could just think something through one more time, my mind would finally rest. In reality, thinking often did the opposite. It stirred the water instead of settling it. I began telling myself quietly that tonight did not need answers, that tomorrow could hold what tonight did not need to solve. This was not avoidance, it was trust. Trust that I did not need to carry every question into sleep to remain responsible or prepared. The body responded to this trust almost immediately. When I stopped forcing closure on my thoughts, my breathing slowed. My shoulders softened. I felt less compressed, less braced. Sleep no longer felt like something I had to chase. It began to approach on its own. I also noticed how late-day urgency lingered in my muscles. Even when I sat still, my body felt ready to move, as if it were waiting for instructions. This readiness followed me into bed. My legs felt restless. My chest felt tight. I had learned to live with this sensation, but once I noticed it, I could not ignore it. Letting the day wind down meant letting that readiness fade. I started ending my days with signals of safety rather than stimulation, softer light, fewer decisions, familiar, predictable actions. These signals told my body that it was allowed to power down. Over time, my system began to recognize these cues and respond more quickly. There was also something deeply reassuring about routine at this stage of life. Not rigid routine, but gentle rhythm. Knowing how the evening would unfold reduced mental effort. Fewer choices meant less engagement. Less engagement meant easier rest. I found that when evenings were rushed or unpredictable, sleep suffered. When evenings were calm and familiar, sleep felt closer, more accessible. This pattern repeated itself often enough that I could no longer dismiss it as coincidence. Another important realization was that emotional residue travels easily into the night. Conversations that ended without resolution, news that stirred worry, memories that surfaced unexpectedly. When these entered the evening without time to settle, they followed me into bed. I began allowing myself a brief emotional clearing before sleep, not by analyzing or fixing anything, but by acknowledging what was present. A quiet moment to recognize the day as it was complete, imperfect, finished. This acknowledgement brought a sense of closure that my body seemed to understand. Sleep, I learned, does not require perfection. It requires permission. Permission to stop. Permission to rest. Permission to leave some things undone. As I practiced letting the day wind down, I noticed a shift, not just in how quickly I fell asleep, but in how deeply I slept. The first stretch of sleep grew longer. My body stayed settled instead of waking at the slightest disturbance. Mornings felt less abrupt. I woke with a sense that rest had actually occurred. This change did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, the way most meaningful changes do. Some nights were easier than others, but even on difficult nights, I noticed that my body returned to calm more easily when the evening had been gentle. What surprised me most was how this practice affected my days. When I knew the evening would offer true closure, I felt less urgency during the day. I did not rush as much. I did not feel as pressured to finish everything before sunset. There was comfort in knowing that rest was not something I had to fight for at the end of the day. Letting the day wind down also changed how I viewed sleep itself. Sleep was no longer a reward for exhaustion or a battle against wakefulness. It became a natural continuation of a day lived with intention. I began to see that many sleep struggles are not problems of the night, but of the evening. How we live the final hours before bed matters more than we often realize. The body remembers the tone of those hours. It carries that tone forward. As this practice settled in, I felt a growing sense of dignity around rest. Rest was no longer something I squeezed in after proving my worth through productivity. It became something I protected because I understood its value. This shift laid the foundation for everything that followed. Once the day could end gently, Another truth became clear. Even the most thoughtful evening routine could not overcome a bedroom that worked against rest. The space itself mattered more than I had ever considered. And so, attention turned from time to place, from how I ended the day to where I asked my body to sleep. That awareness led naturally into the next change, creating a bedroom that felt calm, predictable, and truly supportive of rest. For a long time, I thought of my bedroom as nothing more than a place where sleep was supposed to happen. I paid little attention to how it felt, how it sounded, or how it greeted me at the end of the day. It was functional, familiar, and because it had always been that way, I assumed it was fine. As I got older and sleep became less reliable, I began to notice something important. The bedroom itself was often asking my body to stay alert. There were small things I had grown used to without question. Light that was never quite dark enough, sounds that blended into the background but never fully disappeared, objects that reminded me of tasks, obligations, or unfinished plans. None of these felt disruptive on their own. Together, they created a space that felt busy rather than restful. The body is sensitive to its surroundings, especially when it is asked to rest. Even subtle stimulation can keep the nervous system partially engaged. I had been asking my body to sleep in a space that never fully signaled safety or stillness. The first realization was that calm is not accidental. It is created. I began paying attention to how my bedroom made me feel the moment I entered it. Not intellectually, but physically. Did my shoulders relax or did they stay lifted? Did my breathing slow or did it remain shallow? These cues told me more than any sleep advice ever had. Light was the first thing I noticed. Even low-level light can suggest wakefulness to the body. Over time, I learned that darkness does more than help you fall asleep. It helps the body stay asleep. I softened the light in the room, not dramatically, but deliberately. The difference was immediate. My eyes rested more easily. My thoughts slowed sooner. Sound followed closely behind. I had grown accustomed to background noise, distant activity, small interruptions that I barely registered consciously. But my body registered them. When I reduced unpredictable sounds, the room felt steadier, more contained, the kind of steadiness that invites rest. Then there was clutter. I had never considered myself cluttered, but I had allowed many small things to accumulate. Stacks of papers, books I meant to read, objects waiting to be dealt with later. Each one carried a quiet reminder of something unfinished. When the lights went out, those reminders did not disappear. They lingered in the mind. Creating a calm bedroom meant removing visual noise, not stripping the room bare, but simplifying it, giving the eyes fewer things to process. The result was subtle but powerful. When the room felt settled, my thoughts followed. Temperature also played a role. As the body ages, its ability to regulate temperature changes. I noticed that even slight discomfort kept me half awake, adjusting the environment so my body did not need to work to stay comfortable, allowed sleep to deepen naturally. What surprised me most was how predictability changed everything. When the bedroom remained consistent, same layout, same lighting, same quiet, the body learned to associate that space with rest. Over time, simply entering the room began to trigger relaxation. My breathing slowed without effort. My muscles softened without instruction. The bedroom became a signal, not just a location. I also learned that the bedroom holds emotional memory. Stressful nights leave traces. So do peaceful ones. By protecting the space from activities that stirred emotion or urgency, I slowly reshaped that memory. The room became less associated with wakefulness and more associated with rest. This did not require perfection. Some nights were still restless, but the baseline changed. Sleep felt more available, more cooperative. Creating a calm bedroom did not solve sleep on its own, but it removed a major obstacle. It gave my body a fighting chance to do what it already knew how to do. Once the space itself began supporting rest, another pattern became clear. Even in the calmest rooms, sleep struggled when my body did not know when it was supposed to rest. Irregular rhythms confused it. Consistency, I learned, was the next quiet practice that mattered. Once my bedroom began to feel calmer and more supportive, I expected sleep to settle naturally. In some ways it did, but there were still nights when rest felt unpredictable. Some evenings I felt sleepy early. Other nights my body stayed alert far past when I wanted it to stop. I began to realize that even a calm space cannot compensate for a body that doesn't know when rest is supposed to happen. For most of my life, sleep followed exhaustion. I stayed busy until I couldn't stay awake any longer, and then sleep arrived whether I invited it or not. That pattern worked when my body was younger and more forgiving. As I grew older, that same approach left my system confused. My body no longer responded reliably to fatigue alone. It needed rhythm. The body learns through repetition. It responds to patterns far more than to intention. I could want to sleep deeply, but if my days and nights lacked consistency, my body had no clear signal to follow. I began paying attention to timing, not with rigidity, but with awareness. I noticed that when my sleep and wake times drifted too far from day to day, my nights became lighter and more fragmented. My body hesitated, unsure of what was expected. When my schedule was steadier, sleep arrived with less resistance. This was not about forcing myself into an early bedtime or lying awake in the dark hoping for rest. It was about gently teaching my body what to expect. When wake-up times stayed reasonably consistent, the body began preparing for rest earlier in the evening on its own. Sleep stopped feeling like an event I had to trigger, and started feeling like a natural phase of the day. Morning, I learned, matters just as much as night. When mornings began at wildly different times, my internal rhythm lost its anchor. Even if I slept late to make up for a rough night, the following evening often became more difficult. The body prefers predictability over compensation. Keeping mornings steady helped nights become steadier as well. I also noticed how daylight influenced everything. Exposure to natural light earlier in the day helped my body understand when daytime began. That understanding carried forward, making it easier to let go when evening arrived. When days felt blurred, nights did too. Teaching the body when to rest also meant respecting transitions. Moving directly from stimulation into bed confused my system. When I allowed a predictable winding down period, even a short one, my body recognized the sequence. Over time, it began responding automatically. Consistency does not mean perfection. Life interrupts rhythms. Some nights will always be different. What mattered was the overall pattern, not the exception. When the pattern was clear, my body recovered more easily from disruptions. One of the most important realizations was that supplements and shortcuts often try to replace what rhythm provides naturally. I'd tried melatonin in the past. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it didn't. What it never did was teach my body anything. Rhythm, on the other hand, created learning. I stopped viewing sleep as something external I needed to add, and began seeing it as something internal I needed to support. When my days followed a gentle structure, my nights followed suit. Over time, I noticed that my body began signaling sleep earlier. Yawning returned, eyes grew heavy, thoughts slowed without effort. These signals had not disappeared with age. They had been drowned out by irregular rhythms. Teaching the body when it's time to rest restored those signals. Sleep became less of a negotiation and more of a response. Even when I woke during the night, my body returned to rest more easily. It remembered what night was for. As rhythm settled in, another layer of sleep disruption revealed itself. Even when my body was ready for rest, my mind sometimes refused to follow. Thoughts resurfaced, emotions stirred, mental tension crept in quietly. I began to understand that rhythm prepares the body, but the mind also needs release. And that release does not happen automatically when the lights go out. That realization led to the next practice, one that addressed what I carried inside me into the night. By the time my days had found a steadier rhythm and my body had learned when rest was expected, I assumed sleep would finally come without interruption. And often it did. But there were still nights when my body lay quietly while my mind stayed awake, turning over thoughts that refused to settle. It became clear that physical readiness alone was not enough. The mind carries its own weight into the night. For many years, I believed that if I lay still long enough, my thoughts would eventually quiet themselves. Sometimes they did. More often, they didn't. They wandered through unfinished conversations, unresolved worries, and imagined futures that had no immediate solution. The body was ready for rest, but the mind was still working. As I grew older, I became more aware of how much mental and emotional tension I carried without realizing it. During the day, activity kept it at bay. In the quiet of night it surfaced. Sleep did not feel elusive because I lacked discipline or routine. It felt elusive because my mind had never been taught how to let go. One of the first things I noticed was how often I replayed the day once I lay down. Small moments grew larger in the dark. Words I had spoken echoed back to me. Things I wished I had said differently appeared with surprising clarity. None of these thoughts required immediate action, yet my mind treated them as urgent. I realized that the mind does not naturally distinguish between daytime problem-solving and nighttime rest. It continues unless guided otherwise. Without intention, it simply fills the quiet with whatever remains unresolved. Releasing mental tension did not mean forcing myself to stop thinking. That only created resistance. Instead, it meant acknowledging what was present and choosing not to carry it further into the night. I began creating a simple mental closing ritual, not rigid or formal, but consistent. Before bed, I allowed myself a few moments to notice what my mind was holding. Concerns, plans, worries, even small irritations. I didn't judge them or try to fix them. I simply recognized them. There is power in recognition. When thoughts are acknowledged, they often soften. The mind relaxes when it feels heard. Emotional tension played an even larger role than I expected. Feelings left unspoken during the day did not disappear at night. They waited. Frustration, sadness, disappointment, even quiet joy all surfaced when there was nothing left to distract me. For a long time, I believed emotions should be managed quietly and quickly. I didn't realize that unprocessed emotions stay active beneath the surface. At night, they seek attention. Sleep becomes difficult not because something is wrong, but because something is unresolved. I learned to allow emotions space before sleep, not in dramatic ways, but gently. Sometimes this meant sitting quietly and letting a feeling pass through without explanation. Other times it meant writing a few words, not to analyze, but to release. Naming an emotion often reduced its intensity. I also noticed how worry disguised itself as responsibility. I told myself I was thinking ahead, being prepared. In reality, many of my nighttime worries had no immediate solution. They kept my nervous system alert without offering protection. Letting go of worry required trust. Trust that what needed attention would still be there in the morning. Trust that rest itself was a form of care, not avoidance. One of the most important shifts was changing how I spoke to myself internally. Harsh self-judgment kept my mind tense. Gentle language softened it. When I replaced criticism with understanding, my thoughts slowed naturally. The body responds to emotional safety. When the mind feels accepted rather than pressured, the nervous system relaxes, breathing deepens, muscles release. Sleep finds fewer obstacles. I also learned to be mindful of what I allowed into my mind late in the evening. Heavy topics, troubling news, and unresolved conversations all carried energy into the night. When these couldn't be avoided, I allowed time afterward for calm to return. Going directly from emotional intensity into bed kept my mind alert. Over time, releasing mental and emotional tension became a practice, not a task. It wasn't something I had to do perfectly. It was something I returned to gently, night after night. Sleep improved not because my life became simpler, but because I stopped carrying everything into the dark. The night became a place of rest rather than review. As my mind learned to release, another realization followed. Some nights were still different. Sleep still varied. And that was not a failure. Understanding this led me to the final practice, one rooted not in control but in acceptance. When I stopped fighting the way sleep changed with age, rest deepened in ways I hadn't expected. As my days grew calmer, my environment more supportive, my rhythms steadier, and my mind gentler at night, I expected sleep to return to what it once was. I thought these practices would bring me back to the long, unbroken nights I remembered from earlier years. But something important became clear along the way. Sleep, like everything else, changes with age, and resisting those changes often creates more restlessness than the changes themselves. For a long time, I measured my sleep against a memory: 8 uninterrupted hours, falling asleep quickly, waking refreshed without effort. When my nights didn't match that picture, I felt something was wrong. I treated each waking as a problem to solve, each light night as a failure. That struggle created tension, and that tension quietly interfered with rest. What I didn't realize at first was that the body I lived in now was not the same body I had lived in decades ago. It carried more history, more experience, more subtle needs. Expecting it to behave exactly as it once had was not realistic, and that expectation itself became an obstacle to peace. Respecting the body's changing sleep needs required letting go of comparison, not just comparison with others, but comparison with my own past. The body was not betraying me, it was adapting. And adaptation deserves understanding, not resistance. I began noticing that my sleep came in different shapes. Sometimes it arrived in shorter stretches. Sometimes it included periods of quiet wakefulness. Sometimes rest came through stillness rather than deep unconsciousness. These experiences felt unfamiliar at first, but they were not harmful. In fact, when I stopped fighting them, they became more restful than I expected. There is a difference between being awake and being agitated. I learned that lying quietly, breathing slowly, and allowing the body to rest even if sleep was light still, provided recovery. When I stopped labeling wakefulness as failure, my nervous system relaxed, and paradoxically, sleep often followed more easily. I also learned to listen more closely to my body's signals. Some nights it wanted rest earlier. Other nights it asked for a slower transition. Honoring those signals helped maintain balance. Forcing sleep on a schedule that no longer fit created frustration. Flexibility brought ease. Acceptance played a powerful role here, accepting that sleep might be lighter at times. Accepting that waking during the night was not an emergency. Accepting that rest could look different and still be meaningful. This acceptance removed pressure. And pressure, I discovered, is one of sleep's greatest obstacles. When I stopped trying to control sleep, it stopped resisting me. Respecting changing sleep needs also meant redefining what good sleep meant. It was no longer about numbers or perfection. It was about how I felt during the day. Was I steady? Was I clear? Did I feel restored enough to engage with life? When the answer was yes, the exact shape of my nights mattered less. I also became gentler with myself on difficult nights. Instead of bracing or worrying, I reminded myself that rest would return. That one night did not define the next, that the body remembers how to sleep, even when it takes longer. This gentleness extended into mornings as well. If sleep had been light, I allowed the day to begin more slowly. I adjusted expectations rather than pushing through exhaustion. This kindness toward my body reduced long-term strain and helps nights recover more naturally. One of the quiet gifts of aging is wisdom. The wisdom to stop fighting what cannot be forced. The wisdom to choose cooperation over control. Sleep responded to that wisdom more than it ever responded to effort. Over time, I noticed that my nights grew steadier, not because they became perfect, but because they became peaceful. Even when sleep was brief, it was deeper. Even when I woke, I returned to rest more easily. The struggle was gone. Looking back, I see how these practices work together. Letting the day wind down created space. A calm bedroom offered safety. Rhythm taught the body what to expect. Releasing mental and emotional tension cleared the way. Respecting change allowed sleep to arrive on its own terms. None of these practices replaced medical care. None promised miracles. What they offered was alignment. Alignment with the body as it is, not as it once was. As I've gotten older, I've learned that sleep is not something to conquer. It's something to allow. When I stopped chasing it and started supporting it, rest found me again, quietly, gently, and reliably. And in that rest, I found something deeper than sleep itself. I found trust. Trust in my body. Trust in the rhythms of age. Trust that peace does not come from control, but from understanding. That trust has made all the difference.